The system was officially shut down, not paused, not decommissioned later. It was declared inactive while the Cold War was still ongoing. And yet, it never stopped responding. Not with messages, not with signals anyone could read, but with patterns that only made sense to the people who built it. This was not a base, not a weapon, and not something you could visit. It was buried beneath the ocean floor, designed to detect the very first moments of nuclear war. And when it was abandoned, it was never truly turned off. Which raises a question no official report ever answers. If no one was listening anymore, why was the system still responding? During the Cold War, the United States Navy deployed a network unlike anything that had existed before. It was not a weapon, it was not a base, and it was never meant to be seen. It was buried. Miles beneath the surface of the ocean, stretched across thousands of kilometers of seabed, lay an invisible listening system designed for one purpose only: to know when war had begun, before anyone else did. The logic was simple. Submarines cannot hide forever. Steel displaces water. Engines vibrate, and the ocean remembers sound. So the Navy turned the ocean itself into a sensor. Long cables were laid across the continental shelf. Hydrophones were anchored into darkness. Signals were routed silently to shore stations that never appeared on maps. If a Soviet ballistic missile submarine moved, this network would know. If it launched, this network would know first. But here is the paradox. The system was designed to detect the opening moments of nuclear war, yet it outlived the moment it was built for. By the mid-1970s, portions of the network were declared obsolete. Technology had advanced. Satellites were improving. Budgets were tightening. Officially, sections of the ocean floor sensor grid were shut down. Power was removed. Maintenance crews were reassigned. Monitoring stations went dark. On paper. What the documents do not clearly explain is how a system like this is actually turned off. Because it was never designed to be. There was no master switch, no single shutdown command, no remote termination signal. Each segment was autonomous. Each cable was passive. Each sensor listened whether anyone was listening back. Years later, during routine oceanographic surveys and unrelated naval signal analysis, something strange began to appear. Background noise that shouldn't have been there. Regularity where randomness was expected. Patterns repeating at intervals too consistent to dismiss as geology, and too subtle to classify as interference. At first, it was ignored. The ocean is loud. Currents shift. Tectonic plates grind. Marine life moves in ways that mimic structure. But then, analysts noticed something else. The signals aligned with old grid coordinates. Coordinates tied to a system that no longer officially existed. According to declassified Navy technical notes from the late Cold War period, certain segments of the network were never physically retrieved. Not because they were forgotten, because retrieving them was considered unnecessary and risky. Dragging miles of hardened cable from the seabed could expose locations, damage other classified systems, or simply cost more than leaving them where they were. So they were left, listening. But here is where the discomfort begins. The system was designed to differentiate between natural ocean noise and man-made movement. It was calibrated to recognize propulsion signatures, pressure disturbances, low-frequency harmonics that only large mechanical objects produce. And those filters did not disappear when the monitoring stations closed. They remained embedded in the hardware, meaning whatever residual activity was detected decades later was not raw sound. It was processed sound, filtered, classified, sorted, which raises a question that Navy documentation never directly answers. If no one was actively monitoring these sensors, why were some of them still responding as if someone was? In internal assessments, the explanation given was conservative. Environmental persistence, residual system behavior, non-actionable data artifacts, careful language, non-committal phrasing, the kind used when engineers know something is happening, but cannot explain why. What we do know is this: the ocean floor network was built to listen for a war that never came. It was abandoned before its final purpose was fulfilled. And parts of it were never truly shut down, not because of negligence, but because the system was never meant to stop listening. And that leaves us with a final, uncomfortable thought. A system designed to detect the beginning of global conflict was left alone in the dark, still listening, still filtering, still responding. And no one can say with certainty what it would recognize as war today. How this system actually worked, and why turning it off was never as simple as the Navy claimed. To understand why this system could never be fully shut down, you first have to understand something uncomfortable about how it was built. It was never designed to be controlled from a single place. There was no central switch, no master console, no final shutdown command. Each section of the network operated independently, listening whether anyone asked it to or not, which leads to a problem no Cold War engineer could solve at the time. How do you turn off a system that was never designed to stop listening? To understand why this system never truly went silent, you have to understand how it was built. There was no central switch, no single control room, no moment where someone could say, "Shut it all down." That was not an oversight. It was a requirement. The ocean floor sensor network was designed for one scenario only: nuclear war. And in that scenario, centralized control was considered a weakness. If a command center was destroyed, if communications were cut, if leadership was gone, the system still needed to listen. So the Navy built it in fragments. Each section of the network operated independently. Each cluster of sensors fed into regional relay points. Each relay point processed sound locally before passing anything onward. In simple terms, the system did not wait for instructions. It listened first. It decided what mattered second, and only then did it report. Which creates a problem no shutdown order could easily solve. If you remove power from one station, the others remain active. If you close a monitoring facility, the sensors keep recording. If you stop reviewing the data, the system does not stop classifying it. It simply accumulates. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What happens to a warning system when no one is there to receive the warning? According to Cold War-era engineering doctrine, the answer was nothing. The system was considered harmless once disconnected, passive, dormant. But that assumption only holds if the hardware truly stops functioning. And in many cases, it didn't. Large portions of the network relied on passive acoustic detection. They did not transmit constantly. They waited. Waiting required almost no power. In some configurations, none at all. Sound traveled through water. Pressure waves passed through the seabed. The sensors responded mechanically before they responded electronically. Which means, even without active oversight, the system could still behave like a system. Listening, filtering, separating noise from movement. This is where later analysts began to feel uneasy, because when residual signals were detected years after shutdown, they weren't random. They followed classification rules that only made sense if the system was still operating within its original logic. And that logic had only one purpose: to identify submarines. Not whales, not earthquakes, not storms, submarines. Which leads to another question. If the system was still capable of distinguishing man-made movement, what was it distinguishing it from? Official explanations stayed careful. Engineers pointed to legacy signal behavior, environmental overlap, statistical coincidence. All reasonable words, but none of them addressed the core issue. The network was designed to escalate alerts, not to interpret context, not to understand politics, not to know when a war had ended. It only knew patterns, and patterns once embedded in hardware do not expire. During the Cold War, this made sense. If enough sensors detected a matching signature, the system flagged it. Humans decided what to do next. But when the human layer was removed, the first half of that process still existed: detection without decision, classification without command, which introduces a risk no one had planned for. A system that can recognize the early stages of war, but has no awareness of whether war is still possible, no awareness of treaties, no awareness of doctrine changes, no awareness of time. It listens the same way it always did. This is why the Navy never fully documented what happened to every segment of the network. Some were retrieved, some were abandoned, some were quietly integrated into newer systems, and some were simply left where they were, because removing them raised too many questions. Questions like, what if they were still functional? What if they were still classifying sound? What if turning them off required exposing how they worked? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, what if a system designed to detect the start of nuclear war was never supposed to be turned off at all? The system didn't know the Cold War was over. To understand why this network still matters, you have to understand what it was never meant to hear. The ocean floor sensor network was not designed to monitor everything. It was selective, extremely selective. It ignored most of the ocean, wind, rain, surface waves, even most marine life. All of that was filtered out early, treated as background noise. The system was built to listen for one thing only: movement that did not belong. During the Cold War, the greatest threat did not come from missiles in the air. It came from submarines that no one could see. Ballistic missile submarines were designed to disappear, to sit quietly in deep water and wait. If war ever began, they would be among the first to act. That made them the Navy's primary concern, and it shaped how the system listened. Submarines leave acoustic fingerprints, not loud ones, not obvious ones, subtle ones. A slight rhythm in propulsion, a pressure pattern caused by hull displacement, low-frequency harmonics that repeat over time. The system was trained, mechanically, not intelligently, to recognize those patterns. It did not know what a submarine was. It only knew what a submarine sounded like when compared to everything else, which leads to an important distinction. The system did not identify targets. It categorized them. Anything that matched a known signature moved into a different class of attention, and once something entered that category, it stayed there until proven otherwise. This worked when humans were watching. Analysts could review the data, compare it with intelligence reports, dismiss false positives. But without that layer, the system behaved differently, because classification did not stop just because no one was looking. The filters were physical, embedded in hardware, tuned during construction, which means the system did not simply record sound. It evaluated it, and that evaluation followed Cold War assumptions, assumptions that no longer apply. During later analysis, engineers noticed something unsettling. Some residual detections matched the structure of submarine signatures, without matching any known vessel, too consistent to be geological, too regular to be biological, not loud enough to be modern propulsion, not chaotic enough to be natural. They were never logged as contacts, but they were not dismissed either. They were labeled cautiously. Unresolved acoustic events, a phrase that sounds harmless, until you remember what the system was built to ignore. Whales did not match, seismic activity did not match, surface traffic did not match. Which raises a difficult question. If the system was filtering out almost everything, what was left? Officially, there was no cause for concern. The Cold War had ended. The threat environment had changed. The system was no longer operational. But the detections didn't stop because doctrine changed. They stopped being interpreted. And there is a difference. The system was never designed to ask why something was moving, only whether it matched a pattern associated with strategic threat. That distinction matters, because during the Cold War, the ocean was far less crowded. Fewer submarines, fewer undersea cables, less human activity at depth. Today, the environment is different. And yet, some of the classifications recorded by the system follow logic frozen in time. Logic that assumes certain movements can only mean one thing, which creates a dangerous mismatch. A Cold War warning system operating in a post-Cold War world. Listening for threats that may no longer exist, or interpreting new activity using outdated rules. This is why the Navy never publicly detailed what the system was still hearing. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ambiguous. Ambiguity is manageable when humans are involved. It is far less comfortable when systems are left alone. Because the system does not adapt, it does not learn, it does not reconsider. It listens, it compares, it categorizes, the same way it always has. And that leads to the question analysts quietly asked but never documented. If a system designed to detect the opening moments of nuclear war is still classifying movement beneath the ocean, what would it recognize as the beginning of something today? The system moved forward. Its thinking didn't. By the time the Cold War officially ended, the ocean floor network had already slipped into an unusual category. It was no longer central to doctrine, no longer fully funded, no longer openly discussed. But it was not gone. That created a problem the Navy had not faced before. What do you do with a warning system that still exists, but no longer fits the war it was built for? The answer, quietly, was compromise. Some segments were dismantled, others were upgraded. A few were repurposed into newer monitoring frameworks, and many were simply absorbed, not announced, not renamed, just connected, because starting over would have meant explaining too much. During the 1990s, as defense priorities shifted, undersea monitoring did not disappear. It evolved. New concerns replaced old ones. Regional conflicts, rogue submarines, unidentified undersea activity. The ocean was no longer just a Cold War battlefield. It was becoming infrastructure, cables, pipelines, research arrays. And in that transition, fragments of the old network found new relevance. Not because they were modern, but because they already existed. They were already placed in strategic locations, already calibrated for deep water acoustics, already proven to survive decades without maintenance, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Some systems were not shut down, they were inherited. Engineers integrating newer platforms encountered something unexpected. Legacy data streams, signals routed through paths no longer documented in modern schematics, processing rules that predated current software standards. The system logic was older than the systems now surrounding it. And yet, It still worked. That is not unusual in military infrastructure. What was unusual was what those legacy components still assumed. They assumed escalation. They assumed that certain patterns meant imminent danger. They assumed that detection mattered more than interpretation. Those assumptions made sense when warning time was measured in minutes. They make far less sense in a world where detection is constant. But systems do not update their beliefs. They continue to apply the rules they were built with, which introduces a quiet risk, not of automatic war, not of rogue launches, but of inherited urgency. A system that flags activity with a sense of threat that no longer matches reality. Most of the time, this is harmless. Analysts ignore it. Noise is filtered. Data is archived. But occasionally something stands out. An anomaly that doesn't fit current models, yet matches older ones disturbingly well. At that point, someone has to decide how seriously to take it. And that decision is harder when the system reporting it was built for a different era. This is why documentation around the network becomes vague after the Cold War. Not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening no longer fit clean categories. The system was not active, but it was not inactive either. It existed in a gray space, listening, reporting, but no longer defining outcomes. And gray systems create gray accountability. If something is detected, who is responsible? If it's ignored, who decided it wasn't important? If it turns out to matter later, who was supposed to notice? These questions do not appear in public reports. They appear in internal discussions, in risk assessments, in quiet decisions, to leave things alone. Because touching legacy systems often creates more problems than it solves. Removing them risks exposure. Upgrading them risks altering behavior. Explaining them risks attention. So they remain, not hidden, just unspoken. This is how a Cold War system survives into a post-Cold War world. Not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as something unresolved. Still operating according to rules written for a moment in history that never fully arrived. And that matters, because when systems outlive the conflicts they were built for, they don't become neutral. They become ambiguous. And ambiguity in military warning architecture is never comfortable, especially when the system in question was designed to recognize the first signs of nuclear war. Still listening, still categorizing, still assuming that certain movements mean something they may no longer mean. The world changed. The system did not. For most of its existence, the ocean floor network did exactly what it was built to do. It listened, it filtered, it classified, and then it waited for humans to decide what the data meant. But there were moments when that balance became fragile. Moments when the system produced results that did not fit the world around it, yet fit its own internal logic perfectly. These moments rarely appeared in public records. They surfaced quietly, as anomalies, as brief alerts, as reports that went nowhere. Because the system did not raise alarms the way people imagine. It did not sound sirens. It did not flash warnings. It flagged probabilities. A pattern crossed a threshold. A classification moved from the background to interest. A signal was marked as unusual. And then it waited. That waiting is where the danger lived. Because during the Cold War, unusual almost always meant hostile. The system was calibrated for scarcity. Few submarines, few actors, clear sides. If something moved in a certain way, there were limited explanations. After the Cold War, that clarity vanished. Undersea traffic increased. Research vessels expanded their reach. Autonomous systems entered the water. But the sensor network did not learn these changes. It still compared new sounds against old assumptions, which created moments of mismatch, sounds that were not dangerous, but were unfamiliar enough to resemble danger. In internal reviews, analysts noticed that some detections were escalating faster than expected, not to panic, not to action, but to attention. They demanded explanation. And explanations were harder to give when the system producing them was older than the analysts reviewing the data. One report described the issue carefully. The system exhibits heightened sensitivity to structured low-frequency activity, inconsistent with contemporary threat models. A long sentence. A safe sentence. What it really meant was simpler. The system was reacting as if the Cold War were still happening. That created a subtle pressure. Not the pressure to launch weapons, but the pressure to interpret urgency. If a system says something is unusual often enough, people begin to wonder whether they are missing something. And that is where human psychology enters the loop. Analysts are trained to ignore noise. They are also trained to fear missing the one signal that matters. The ocean floor network sat directly in that tension. Most of the time, its alerts were dismissed, archived, forgotten. But occasionally something lined up. A detection coincided with an exercise, or a geopolitical event, or increased naval movement elsewhere. Suddenly, an old system's output felt relevant again. And relevance is dangerous when context is incomplete. The system did not know why activity increased. It only knew that it had. Which raises a difficult question. At what point does a warning system stop being a tool and start shaping the perception of threat itself? The Navy never lost control of the system, but control is not always binary. Sometimes control erodes quietly. When systems are trusted because they have always been trusted. When outputs are respected because they once mattered. This is why certain segments of the network were never fully reintegrated or fully removed. They were too useful to discard, too outdated to rely on completely. So they remained in a kind of limbo, consulted but not centered, heard but not obeyed. That may sound safe, but it creates an invisible influence, a system that no longer decides outcomes, but still nudges attention, still frames questions, still whispers, "This matters." And once that whisper exists, it cannot be unheard, especially in environments built around worst-case planning, because the greatest danger was never that the system would trigger a war. The danger was that it would quietly remind people how wars used to begin, by suggesting that something ordinary might not be ordinary after all, by framing ambiguity as potential threat, by applying old logic to a new world. This is the legacy of systems designed for moments that never arrived. They don't disappear. They linger. And sometimes they influence decisions long after their original purpose has faded. Not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to matter. In the end, the ocean floor network never failed. It did exactly what it was built to do. It listened, it filtered, it compared, and it waited. What changed was not the system. It was the world around it. The Cold War ended without the moment this network had been designed for. No sudden launch, no unmistakable acoustic signature of war, no final confirmation that the system's purpose had been fulfilled. Instead, the conflict dissolved. Treaties were signed, doctrines shifted, threats became less clear, less symmetrical, and the system was left behind, not broken, not obsolete, but unfinished. That matters, because systems built for absolute struggle in a world of ambiguity. During the Cold War, the ocean floor network existed to answer one question: has the war begun? It was not designed to ask follow-up questions. It was not designed to weigh probabilities. It was not designed to consider political nuance. It existed to reduce uncertainty at the most dangerous possible moment. And that moment never came. So the system was never given closure. It was never proven right. It was never proven wrong. It simply remained, listening beneath the ocean while the world above it moved on. This is why fragments of the network still provoke unease among those who understand what it was meant to do. Not because it poses an immediate danger, but because it represents a mindset frozen in hardware. A way of interpreting the world where silence is suspicious, where movement implies intent, where delay equals risk. Those assumptions made sense when warning time was measured in minutes. They make far less sense now. And yet, they are still embedded, not in policy, but in physical systems that were never redesigned from the ground up. The ocean floor network was not alone in this. Across the Cold War landscape, similar systems exist. Early warning radars, command bunkers, communication relays, all built for moments that almost happened. All left to age quietly once those moments passed. Together, they form a kind of infrastructure of anticipation. Not weapons, not decisions, expectations. And expectations shape behavior, even when no one realizes it. That is the quiet legacy of the Cold War. Not the missiles, not the speeches, but the systems built to respond instantly if everything went wrong. The ocean floor network listened for decades without ever hearing the sound it was designed to detect. No launch signatures, no unmistakable confirmation, just the constant background of a world that never crossed the final line. In that sense, the system succeeded. It did not fail to warn. It warned against something that never arrived. And perhaps that is why it is so difficult to fully dismantle systems like this. They feel incomplete, as if turning them off entirely would tempt fate, as if silence might invite the very thing they were meant to detect. So they remain, not active, not inactive, just present. A reminder that for a long time, humanity built machines to survive the first moments of its own destruction, and then never tested whether those machines were right. The ocean floor network was built to hear the opening sound of nuclear war. Instead, it heard nothing. And in that nothing, it became part of a different story. Not about war, but about restraint, about hesitation, about how close the world came to building systems that expected catastrophe, and how quietly those systems endured when catastrophe never came. The war it listened for never happened, but the system kept listening anyway. The system was built for a moment that never arrived. It listened for the opening sound of nuclear war and heard nothing, not because it failed, but because the world stepped back. And somewhere beneath the ocean floor, a machine designed for the end of everything was left waiting for a war that never was.